In San Francisco, California, tenants make big money off of the backs of landlords by scamming the rent control program. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. Alright, so I have an interesting topic for you today, and it has to do with rent control, and specifically in San Francisco, California. I've covered the topic of rent control many times, so the people who watch my videos should know how I feel about it. I hate it. I absolutely hate it. I think it's a horrible idea. It's a socialist program and it should be eliminated wherever it's implemented, okay? It should not exist, okay? But it does. And unfortunately, it is really hurting the landlords who have to deal with it. Now, obviously, the intent of the rent control was to keep prices low for the poor tenants who, they need affordable housing, but that is not what is happening. And that's exactly what I'm going to cover in this article today. Instead, what these tenants are doing is they are subleasing their rent controlled units for big profits, okay? They are making money. All of that profit that you think those landlords, aren't entitled to, well, the tenants are taking that profit for themselves by subletting their units or rooms in their units or whatever, okay? And it's a complete scam, okay? Basically, you're not actually improving the affordability of the housing in the area, and you're taking this profit, and rather than letting the landlord take it, the one who is making all the investments in the property and trying to keep the property nice, you're giving it to a tenant, an undeserving tenant who in many cases doesn't even live in the unit, okay? They're just leasing it out for a much, much higher price, probably the market rate, to someone else and pocketing the difference. This is so stupid, and they should have realized that this was going to be an issue, but this is exactly what the rent control policy creates. Anyway, before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button. Maybe leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think, okay? If you were a rent control tenant, or if you are a rent control tenant, and you're renting your unit for way, way below the market rents, right? Well, would you, just, hey, you know what? I'm going to make a few hundred or $1,000 or more a month and rent this place out, sublease it to someone else? Would you do that? Why do they even permit this? It shouldn't even be legal, in my opinion, to do that. But hey, a lot of tenants are doing this, and they're off of the books, and they're scamming the system, in my opinion. Not that it's a good system in the first place, but it defeats the purpose of rent control. Okay, and this is why the whole thing should just be thrown out. It's not helping. Anyway, let's get into this article. It's quite insightful. Now, this article was written kind of in a more tenant perspective, and I don't think they expected somebody like me, a landlord, to look at this and realize, hey, this is not the way things are supposed to be run. But anyway, let's go. It's coming from sfgate.com, and it says, having a master tenant may be the only affordable way to rent in San Francisco. It also comes with a lot of risk. All right, let's get into it. San Francisco has all kinds of unique rental situations, from bunk bed pods to beds that descend from the ceiling. Living in one of the most expensive cities in the country forces people to get creative in order to find semi-affordable housing. And one of the best ways to get a deal is to luck into a room in a San Francisco apartment that's been rent controlled for years. But when you sign up to live with someone who's paying far below market rate, they're not just becoming your roommate, they're also becoming your landlord. The master tenant, as they're often known, gets to decide your rent. You'll likely cut a check directly to them and even funnel repair requests their way. This situation is ripe for conflict, seeing as one person has drastically more power than the other tenants. But it's not a perfect arrangement for the de facto landlord either. They often hold even more power than they may have bargained for. So yeah, basically what they're saying is, hey, you know what? These rent-controlled tenants are literally becoming the landlord, because that rent-controlled tenant has more rights to the property than the property owner themselves. Okay, they can't be evicted as long as they keep paying. Their rent can't raise that much. They get these super low, below market rents, and then all they have to do is say, hey, maybe I'll rent out a room in here. And the rental of one room is enough to cover the entire way below market rent in a lot of cases. Or they might not even live in there and they're going to rent it out for the market rate. I mean, I don't know if there's anything that would stop anyone from, just saying, hey, I'm paying $1,000 a month. Market rate is $3,000 a month. So I'm going to just sublease the entire unit for $3,000 a month. I could see something like that happen. It probably does every single day. To understand a master tenant situation, it's important to start with rent control and all the rules that come along with it. More than 60% of San Francisco rental units are subject to rent control. Specifically, rental units in a building constructed before June 13, 1979 qualify. Under the San Francisco Rent Board, people living in rent-controlled apartments are entitled to special protections regarding rent increases and eviction. Their apartments are likely cheaper than market rate and can only increase in rent costs by a certain amount each year. The San Francisco Rent Board sets a percentage per year based on the Consumer Price Index in the San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose region for a 12-month period. The allowable annual increase from March 2021 to February 28, 2022 was 0.7%. So yeah, keep that in mind, right? I just have to point that out. They said that the allowable increase in that area was 0.7% for rent-controlled units, okay? Now, they say that they set it based upon the Consumer Price Index. Now, obviously, the Consumer Price Index, right, it's BS. It's garbage. It's a lie. They don't set the rents based upon the Consumer Price Index, and that is so obvious right now because of inflation. Okay? Right now, we had nearly 9% inflation in this same time period where they only allowed landlords to raise their rents by 0.7%. Okay? So as you can tell, this thing is set by, arbitrary standard by a bunch of socialists, okay, who don't give a crap about, even the laws that they implemented. So, hey, it's a complete joke. But, what can I say? If you are a landlord and you invested in that market, you should have known about this when you got started, okay? And that's exactly why I don't invest in this sort of place. But continuing, if you moved into your current 2-bedroom apartment in 2010 and paid $2,800 a month, the most your rent could be now is $3,339. That's about 15% below the median rent for a 2-bedroom apartment, according to Zumper's most recent rental estimations. These arrangements are pretty much the only affordable arrangements that are left, said Scott Weaver, an attorney and volunteer with the San Francisco Tenants Union. It's unfortunate in this tight housing market because you want to be able to be picky about who you have as a master tenant. But what they don't mention is that if you are in a rent control unit, it's most likely that you have been there for an extremely long amount of time. I think I read somewhere that, the average rent controlled tenant has been there 15 plus years. Okay. So if you were renting a place, 15 years ago and you're still paying extremely below the subsidized rental amount. And in some cases, there's people who've been in their units for 30, even 40 years, okay? And they've gone so far as to, pass it on to their children or whatever, just trying to keep that super low rent. So imagine you came in there, you moved to San Francisco back when you were 20 years old, 40 years ago, okay? And you got your rent controlled unit. And you moved out a long time ago, but now you're subleasing it and you're making a pretty hefty profit on that difference between how much you pay for rent and how much you're charging your tenants, acting as a de facto landlord, okay? So the problem with that is that, hey, the new tenants, they don't get to enjoy the affordable housing like you do. The landlord doesn't get enough money to actually be able to perform the maintenance and repairs and capital expenditures that they need. And overall, the city just becomes even more expensive to live in because of those factors, okay? So it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't. Okay, the whole system is just rife with abuse because of the rules that the government put in place, thinking that it was actually going to solve the affordable housing crisis. But, you have to wonder, why is San Francisco the most expensive place to live in the entire country if these rent control policies are in place? Because the rent control policies are actually what's driving the price of housing up. So I'm going to skip down a little bit on in this article because there's some interesting little facts here, and it says, Search master tenant on Twitter, and there are plenty of horror stories out there. A common grift? Master tenants charging subtenants an amount that adds up to more than the actual rent, allowing them to keep the profit. Adam, who declined to give his last name, said when he first moved to San Francisco, he found a 2-bedroom apartment in Nob Hill with a master tenant who was never around. A nice perk. But the master tenant later rented her room out to another tenant who was very messy and then eventually stopped paying rent entirely. Adam came home one day to find a note taped to the front door that showed the full rent amount of the apartment, which was far lower than the half he was paying for his room. The full rent for the apartment was $2,150, and his rent for the smaller bedroom was $1,500. Yeah, like I said, the master tenant, the quasi landlord, is pocketing just a ton of money by renting out this unit and screwing the actual owner of the property over. The master tenant moving out of their apartment entirely happens more than you'd think, whether or not they ever plan to return. Some San Franciscans get a room in a master tenant run apartment that's too cheap to leave, even though the master tenant is dangerous, abusive, or just a plain terrible roommate. Well, they can only blame themselves for that. If you're too cheap to leave, then, you have to just face the fact that you have to deal with those problems when, you are renting a room with somebody who, is a dangerous person. I mean, if it was up to me, the property owner would be able to evict that person, and you wouldn't be living there in the first place, though. So I guess that wouldn't wouldn't be good for you regardless. Okay, but there's no reason to keep a dangerous person in your unit. But because of the tenant protections in San Francisco, that's exactly what happens. So yeah, they're sitting here and they're complaining. This whole article is about people who are complaining that, hey, this master tenant situation, it isn't fair to the people who are looking for housing. No, it's not fair to them. But even worse, it's unfair to the actual landlord, the actual property owner who, gets completely screwed. They're not able to raise the rents. Meanwhile, this tenant is able to pocket hundreds or thousands of dollars off of the backs of all of the landlord's investment.